I'd like to welcome you all here, and I want to just do my acknowledgement to country to start with. So I am on Bonga people's land in Mona Vale in Sydney, and I want to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging who have taken care of this land for many thousands and thousands of years. And I'd like to pay my respects for all our ancestral heritage that brought us here today. So I'm delighted to welcome Audrey McGibbon. Audrey came across Audrey in 2021 because I got to do the accreditation for the Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey as part of the Homeward Bound Leadership Initiative. And since then, it's been one of my two go-to profiles that I use with leaders because wellbeing is a topic that people don't know in depth to the extent that what Audrey's developed is a survey that looks at what does fully thriving look like inside and outside of work. And I think it gives you the detail of what does fully thriving and flourishing look like. So today is about a conversation, and today is about hearing the latest findings and the research Audrey's done on the wellbeing survey after using it for 12 years and all the, 4,000 people who have completed it or more. Oh, we can't hear you on mute. You're on mute, Audrey.
We're closer to 11,000 since 2016. So the first few years we were iterating the tool, but since 2016 it's been locked down. We've got close to 11,000 now. And the report is based on just under 9,000, about half of whom are women. We were incredibly fortunate, just as a dint of the way that we do our research, we have got roughly 50% male. And we have 51% female, we have 37% male, and we've got 13% who didn't bother answering a question, which we suspect would be mostly made up of men. But there you go, there's the first provocation.
Okay. Before we actually begin, I'd really love it if everyone could put their videos on. I realize there's going to be people from all around the world joining, and so it might be the middle of the night. In that case, do keep your video off if you would rather not be there in your pajamas. So I want to begin with this slide. So our topic is about why brilliant women leaders are burning out and what we can do about it. So as I said, it's going to be an interview. I'm going to be interviewing Audrey with some questions, and then she's going to interview me because I've got a case study that I've actually worked on a few years ago during the bushfire, the impact of the bushfires with 50 principals who are in rural and remote areas of New South Wales. And I was brought in with two other coaches to actually help with their wellbeing. And so I want to share some of that as well. But before we begin, many of you have responded to this question, but if you haven't, could you put in the chat, what are you curious about? Are you curious about gender wellbeing for you as an individual or your organization or both? And then the second question is, what are your top 2 wellbeing actions that you take every day to help you be in the best place you can be? And I might ask you, Audrey, what are your top 2 things that you do each day for your wellbeing?
I'm much better about talking about it than I am doing it, but I've got a variety of small things. I always have a coffee, and caffeine is actually good for you in small quantities. But more than that, it's about the ritual. I only have one coffee a day, and it is a ritual, and it is my absolute, I talk about sacrosanct moments. It's one of my sacrosanct moments. I have a Labrador, a black Labrador, and no matter what has happened in that day, I make sure I have some time with my black lab, and we exchange cuddles, and that's pretty cool. So those are the 2 absolute fail me nevers, even on the worst possible days. I have some other healthy habits, but
Yeah,
they're the
love
two that are my
Top two.
go-tos.
Isn't it interesting? I've got a golden Labrador. My thing that I do each day is take him for a walk, and I just love seeing his happy smile. But the other is my ocean swimming. If I can get in the ocean, that is my favorite thing to do, and I know it always lifts me.
Yeah.
So, as I mentioned before, this is what we're focused on. So you've got a snapshot of each of us. I will begin there in terms of the work that we do, our background, and then we're going to look at the global gender wellbeing gap. And you are the first people to hear it because it's not out there in the public yet, and you'll get a copy of the research at tomorrow. I will be sending it through to you in a link to sign up for it and gain it from Audrey's organisation. Then my case study, and then we'll have time for some Q&A and next step actions in terms of how you can develop in terms of your understanding of your own well-being. So over to you, Audrey. Who is Audrey? We've had a little bit.
There you go. I am a manifestation of my Black Lab coffee. I didn't mention my little veggie patch, which is a new feature having moved to the Central Coast from Balmain about a year and a half ago. So professionally, I am the CEO of eConsents and the co-author of the GLWS Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey. My background is an organizational psychologist and a coaching psychologist. And really, my life is a series of collisions around how to optimize the chances of thriving. And I should know a bit about that. Been married for 26 years, but we met in 1990, so when I was but a child. So that's a very long relationship. I can't do the maths, but it's 30 odd, more than 30 odd years. And I've got two adult, I said allegedly adult children to Annette, but she's kind and omitted the word allegedly, but they're 21 and 24. And I think there's another book in me about parenting of neurodiverse, challenging kids in this era. Maybe some of you on the call could relate to that. And it's not disconnected to our topic today about the roles that we play in life. So who am I? I'm this professional person, and I am a mother, daughter, wife, sister. I like to think good friend, but I'm probably a neglectful friend, and I'm almost always a late friend. I have ADHD. I also have lifelong anxiety. I don't consider either of those particularly debilitating. I see them as strengths in many ways, but that is because I actively manage them both therapeutically and medically. Yeah, that's me. And I'm better at practicing. I'm better at preaching than I am practicing. I'm a work in progress.
I think we all are. So just a little bit about me, coaching and mentoring since 2001. I've trained over 8,800 leaders and mentors of how to be coach-like in how they lead. I've also got over 3,000 hours of individual leadership coaching hours. I live in Mona Vale, have done so. The anniversary is coming up tomorrow for a year. Married for 31 years, have two adult daughters. And I'm passionate, which some of you who know me already, about this thing called solution focus. And I'm part of a global network of consultants who use this approach. And I love sharing that when I'm running Leader as Coach programs. I also, outside of work, my community work is I help mentor people learning to ocean swim. So let's get into what is the Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey to start already, because there's some people on the call who know it well. I can see you, Nicola and Eileen, and there's a few from Homeward Bound who actually have completed it. And some of you may have completed already, but this is for people who don't know anything about it. So I'll hand it back to you, Audrey, just to give a snapshot of what are we talking about in terms of the well-being and the framework you use.
Thanks, Annette. So in a nutshell, the GLWS is an individual self-assessment tool that we created coming out of the global financial crisis through our work in leadership development and executive coaching, where we were seeing and were concerned about the rise in the number of good, capable, well-intentioned individuals, men and women, showing up on these programs or in our coaching rooms a little the worse for wear. Not so much the worse for wear that they would be willing to connect with clinical psychologists or employee assistance programs, but they were, to use the vernacular, they were struggling, and with various degrees of awareness around the struggle, until several sessions into coaching or halfway through the leadership program, this stuff would all come out about different aspects of the ways in which life was a lot more effortful than it had used to be. And I really had a crisis of conscience that said, this stuff has to come out sooner. We have to find a way of accessing this because it is so deeply relevant to these individuals' capacity to lead well and to think well and to feel good about themselves and to sustain themselves. And we can't pretend it doesn't exist, and we can't pretend it isn't having an impact. And it is more than mental health, and it is more than physical fitness. And it's more complicated than that. So how can we make it accessible to people? So that was where the genesis for the idea came from. Way back when, in my first career, I did work for a company called SHL, or as it was known then, Savile and Holdsworth, world leader in psychometric measurement organization. My supervisor was Professor Peter Savile, and fair to say I'd spent 10 years versed in the world of psychometric assessment. I was quite happy to leave all that behind. I was enjoying the more emphasis on development and achieving one's full potential than on measurement. I thought it would be as easy as, having identified the need, we would be able to find a tool that I could put in front of our own clients and that they would be willing to engage with it. I couldn't find that tool. I could find lots of clinical tools. I could find lots of general well-being, are you well, happy and satisfied tools. And I could find some tools that were good at social well-being, some tools that were good at the emotional, psychological resilience, some tools that were good at the physical stuff, some tools that were about good spiritual well-being practices. But I'm greedy and I wanted it all. I knew that for our client base, well-being was a multidimensional construct, and there was no point in measuring one bit without the other bits. And equally, and potentially somewhat controversially, there was no point in measuring it just at work. So we needed to find a way of making it constructive, sensitive, respectful, confidential, to ask about experiences outside of work. As you yourselves will know, it's a nonsense to ignore all of who we are and focus just on our work-based identity. So that's the story. Couldn't find a tool, so created our own. We spent 4 years just refining and iterating, locked away the final version really in 2016. And 2 years ago, we completed an enormous validation study. Melbourne University Centre for Wellbeing Science completed the analysis on that independent of us. And we are very proud to state loudly now that we believe we have a unique tool and the world's best wellbeing assessment tool for professionals in the workplace. I think that's it, Annette.
Awesome. So I thought you might want to mention this as part of the survey. It is a self-assessment survey. It's not a 360. It's very much about building awareness for leaders about their own well-being. And you do this snapshot, which is part of it, which I think it's worth just mentioning.
Okay. And this is a very dull profile of somebody called Taylor Hope, she's fictitious, but this is an individual who, after we've asked them 132 very detailed questions about their well-being. These are global subjective ones that we just put out at the end. Say, okay, you've answered all this stuff. Overall, how well, happy, satisfied do you feel? And the wellness piece we split between relating to work, relating to outside of work. And so this individual has gone, neither high nor low well-being at work, neither high nor low well-being outside of work, which incidentally in well-being mathematics is not well. The absence of feeling positives is an indication that things could be a lot better. They're so satisfied, so happy, and together, they've quite accurately deduced they are struggling overall. And then as you went through this individual's report, we then get the quite forensic breakdown. This is a summary of that individual's overall well-being against the 6 dimensions, both at work and outside of work. On the right-hand side, outside, left-hand side is inside of work. And this is not to go through the ins and outs of it, but simply so that when we come on to talk about the research, you have a good feeling and are able to relate to where this data has come from. It has not come from 8,500 people describing what they think is happening to people's well-being or what they think is happening to women's well-being or men's well-being. It has come from each individual responding to 132 individual questions about these 6 dimensions, 11 related to outside of work in every case and 11 related to inside of work. And so this is about people's lived experiences against the questions that we know are highly correlated with overall well-being.
Okay, I think we get into the interview then about this latest study you're the first to hear about it, people here, which is wonderful. So my first question is, what led you, Audrey, to this latest research, and what's the single most important message you want women leaders to take away from it?
Okay. What led us to the research was in the first 4 years, the early years, as we refer to it when we were iterating, we would look at and see if there were any gender differences. And when we first started in 2012, on a sample of about 1,000, we found very few gender differences, either at those overall dimension levels or at individual item levels. So that was quite interesting. And one of the things generally that you look for in a good measurement tool is that it doesn't show differential impact on different groups. So we thought, that's great, okay. And then we trundle along, we're doing lots of other little measurements and validation studies along the way. COVID arrives, and we think we're hearing a lot about the impact on everyone, but particularly upon working women. Let's go back and have a look at that data. So that was I think we did the analysis end of 21, maybe through till 22, can't remember. Anyway, we had prepared. We were expecting to see some differences, but the size of the differences was really quite confronting. And then this year we thought, if not post-pandemic, we're in a pandemic-adjusted world. We are where we are. Fingers crossed, when we do this analysis again, have we seen things bounce back? And short answer is no, we haven't. So that was the kind of why specifically are we looking at gender wellbeing, because our thing as a business is about leaders and professional people's well-being. So adults employed in complex roles. I wouldn't have held us out and probably wouldn't still hold us out as a gender-specific DEI specialist organization, but there was a responsibility having this data to look at it and see what was going on in there. You had a second part to your question, the single most important.
Yeah. Sorry, I've lost my question.
The takeaway message. What was the most important takeaway message?
Single most important message, yes.
So I would say the single most important message, speaking to you as individuals, is that it is not you and you are not alone. Well-being is not a luxury. It's an enabler of performance, influence, decision-making, as well as your feelings of thriving and leading a full and worthwhile life. And so if well-being isn't where you want it to be, that's not something that should become a point of selfishness to address. It's critical to address it for yourselves and to sustain all the wonderful things about you for other people. That's speaking to you as individuals, but and for an organization, I think the single biggest message is there's something systemic going on here and we need to measure it.
Yeah. So why do you think this is happening, that this gap is widening between men and women's well-being? What's your take on it?
So it's a significant gap. There's less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that what we're discovering is not a phenomenon. And what we're finding is that women are 24.6% more likely to describe themselves as having lower well-being at work than men are. And there's only 1 in 13 women say that they're thriving. That's twice as many unwell as there were pre-2021. So it is pretty significant. And as to why it's happening, I think one thing I would say is that expectations of professionals in complex roles and in leadership roles has increased over the past, not just since COVID years, but it was increasing pre-COVID. One of the other pandemics that got brushed aside was the World Health Organization 2019 declaration of an epidemic of work-related stress and burnout. We were just getting traction on that when COVID-19 hit, and so that kind of got pushed to the side. So there has been a latent increase in expectations and pressures that leaders have been under, irrespective of gender. And in fact, that while our session today is focusing on the really concerning trajectories around women's well-being, it is important to stress that men are not having a picnic. On average, men's well-being at work has also declined significantly since we've been tracking it. So It's not a happy story for anybody in these positions. And so I think it has to be something to do with the context and the expectations of those roles.
Yes. So if
why
you,
women?
yeah,
Why women
sorry.
specifically? I think we can say it's not solely because of failings in us as women. It's not solely because we're doing something wrong. I say solely because we all have capabilities to examine our life and make some better choices. So there's an element of it that, sure, is I am the only person that puts that chocolate in my mouth. I'm the only person that puts myself to bed at night. That's actually not true, because sometimes I get dragged to bed. But so it's not all about failings in women. There is something systemic, but neither is it all about the system. It is just complicated. We do not understand yet how individual interacts with the environment at home or at work or our past. And so there's a lot of complexity going on there. But I do think in the system, we have to start looking or questioning, are there inequalities in the system to do with the jobs that women are doing, the amount of influence, the access to opportunities that come with influence, that come with autonomy, that come with decision-making, that come with control, and that come with high levels of support and sponsorship, because those are the things that help to protect and buffer us. So does that make sense? And please, anyone, we haven't said about questions, but the more time I spend in the space, the harder it is for me to keep hold of where other people who don't spend day in, day out thinking about the stuff are coming from. So if I'm not making sense, please just stick your hand up or turn your mic on.
Audrey, if you were advising senior leaders, how would you get them to treat well-being as a strategic KPI rather than a nice to have?
I think we cannot expect A and measure B. So stop expecting A while you're measuring B. So if I put that into less subtle terms, stop talking about well-being being very important for everyone, or keep talking about well-being being important and keep talking about it as a priority. That's the expectations. It is important. It's important as a human right, and it's important as a predictor of performance. And if you truly believe it is a priority, then a definition of a priority is that it's more important than anything else. How do we measure how do we show what's important in organizations? We measure it. So keep talking about it being important, but unless you are measuring it, you actually have got no basis on which to really validly claim that you are treating it as a priority. That sounds harsh. I am not. Those of you that you know me on the call will know I'm really not terribly good at being diplomatic, but I'm coming from a good place. I'm not meaning to diss on anyone. I'm just trying to make some progress.
So one of your findings, Audrey, was about the juggle struggle. And you said that 70% of women say juggling work and life commitments is taking a toll. What stood out to you most about this?
If I take a step back in it, do you remember the 6 dimensions that I showed you of well-being? Of those 6 dimensions, women score at the lower end of the well-being scale on 5 of those dimensions than men do. And the worst one is the balance and boundaries out of those 5. The 6th area, vitality and energy, it's a tie superficially. On paper, women and men, and how shall I say this, are equally bad because it is the lowest scoring one overall. So that's the context. And by the juggle struggle, we're really particularly focusing on load management, which is picked up under the balance and boundaries dimension. Thank you for sharing that, Annette. God, I've got Annette and Yvette's on the brain this morning. I've spoken to 2 Yvettes and 1 Annette this morning, and it's more than my little brain can cope with. So the data overall since 2016, so not specifically in 2024, I'll come to that shortly, but overall, when we look at the analysis over that past 8-year pattern, women report significantly more instances of feeling their workload is placing them at risk of burnout, more dissatisfaction with the amount of time that they spend working. You don't need to scribble all this down. This is all in the report. And actually, I will just take this moment to say, when you get the report as a summary of, I think it was like, I don't know, nearly 2 million data points. It's just how much detail do we go into? So the stuff that I'm sharing with you is in the report. Women also experience a significantly greater number of disruptions and distractions from family and outside of work personal matters while they are working. So this is contributing to that kind of sense of the juggle struggle. And they are more likely to say that their work days feel like a race against the clock. They're also less likely to say that they feel that what others expect of them in the workplace while they're working is reasonable. So that's just the working well side of things. And there's a whole tranche of stuff going on outside of work, one of which has been there. And it was one of the ones that we did find even way back in the early years was the women report. And guess what? No surprises. They are pulling their weight more at home than men report. So they spend a lot more time doing what we describe in our, the question they have to answer is the extent to which they feel that they are drowning in household chores or personal administration. And 64% of women last year said that is true of them sometimes, usually, or always. And that is a whopping 18% more than men did last year. But it's a trend that we just see year on year. So that's an example of this kind of, this isn't even just an organizational systemic piece. This is a societal piece. And this is where I don't have expertise I'm not in feminism, in gender politics, in gender practices, but I can see how this dovetails into gender identity and the expectations we have of ourselves and the expectations others have of us. Other standout ones, women are 71% say they do not have enough time left for themselves after attending to work and family demands. 79% say they're feeling stuck on fast forward and crave a slower pace. And it was 84% say that they always, usually, or sometimes feel they're racing against the clock. And again, I'll stress, it's not that men are saying, oh no, that's never me, but the numbers are significantly lower.
So I'm conscious time's ticking away, and we've got a couple of more questions to ask. And I'm wondering, even though women report better lifestyle habits than men, so this is the energy paradox, they still feel more exhausted. Why is that?
So this is really interesting. So that's that vitality and energy piece where they tied, men and women tied, but they tied for last place. So it's like, do you want the bad news or the really bad news? Congratulations, we're just as bad as one another. And when we dive under the surface, though, the differences are there. So it's like we've got a regression to the mean, which is why they're overall not showing the differences. But so the women are describing on average that they look after themselves a bit better. And this is the paradox. So why, if women are consistently and significantly saying they eat more nutritiously, both at home and at work, they're careful about their caffeine consumptions, they limit the use of alcohol or recreational drugs for stress relaxation purposes, they get more sleep, all of this sounds quite good. They're much better at doing regular preventative health checkups. They're more inclined to adopt formal breathing techniques as tools to re-energize as they can. So they do all these things just fine. And yet they are significantly less likely to feel well rested at the start of the workday. They take far fewer breaks during their work days to recharge. Sorry, I'm looking at a report here because I can't retain all this. They've got lower levels of get up and go. That's their description. That like at work, it's just a harder, more effortful process. They feel more drained while they're working. They spend longer sitting down. I think that's a really interesting one. Annette and I were pinging this around earlier about why do women spend longer sitting down at work? And we could have an hour's brainstorm on this, but perhaps it's because there are more women in enabling functions roles, back office roles. And on a sample of 2, we have partners who are front of house, out and about, off doing the great and the good, the strategizing and the promoting and the selling and the front of house stuff. That's probably just provocation, and it's certainly not evidence-based, but that would be a hypothesis. And I forgot your question, but it was about can I explain the paradox? And yeah. I think we're doing the right things, but probably because of the load management, we're expecting too much of ourselves, or others are expecting too much of us. And it is simply depletive to do what is being expected of us. And so we're shortchanging. So it's the link between the balance, the absence probably of boundaries. Yes. And the flow-on effects of that. So with well-being, which there's 2 basic strategies. One is to reduce the level of demands that are coming at people. So what can we do to reduce the demands coming at women? Short-term, long-term, organizational versus personal. And particularly where we can't really reduce the demands, we have to then say, how do we optimize our resources? How do we replenish, recover, recharge, fill our cups back up as much as we can? And for us as individuals, it is often easier to, even though it's hard, it is easier to put in place strategies about putting boundaries in place to refill my cup than it is to get rid of some of the expectations of us or of ourselves.
And that's certainly what I've found in my leadership coaching, is particularly around boundaries. It's one of the top things I coach on, is how to have those boundaries in place. So last question. And we're looking at the finding 5, which was the career confidence and agency. Your research found women are less clear and optimistic about their careers. 47% say they have no clear vision for the future. What's behind the drop in confidence and agency?
The sense of clarity over their career and where it's going next, and feeling they have agency or influence over that, I think is stemming from a few individual factors in the report. One is that women are more inclined to say that they feel the work that they are currently doing is less valuable and may or may not make much of a difference in organization. So this is where it's a good item to illustrate what are we dealing with here. Is that a real thing? Are women doing jobs that are truly less valuable and less likely to make a difference? And or do they just feel like that? And or do we have men saying, of course, what do you mean? Of course my job is valuable and makes a difference. Is it to do with personality attributes? Is it to do with socialization? So it's complicated. But certainly, if women don't feel like their roles are particularly valuable or making a difference, that is likely to impact their confidence and optimism about where to next in their careers. They are less likely to have a good, clear direction about what they want for their careers. They report lower levels of optimism about being able to having capacity to shape their careers, and they feel less well suited to their jobs. So I think it's something like 27% of the women in our sample who you might argue are in slightly more enlightened or progressive organizations because they're measuring it and doing this stuff. 27% of those women describe feelings of not feeling particularly well suited to their role, which goes into some of the stuff that we haven't had time to go into today, but also connected to significantly higher levels of self-doubt. And so we're grasping at how much is real, how much is subjective, and what is the interaction between those things. And the last factor, Annette, that we touched on, you're like, oh, you've got to say that bit, because I didn't really draw it out in the report very much, which is that women report that they're less likely to trust their boss than men do. So there is a kind of a collection of those items. So we can describe it from the women's data point of view, but if we flip it and we say men feel more supported and connected with their boss, feel that their jobs make a difference and a valuable contribution, they're more optimistic and confident and feel that they have more of a say over their career direction. You start to build up this piece about the systemic vibe, if you like, that comes with being a bloke versus being a woman in a professional role.
Yeah. I've seen your question, Jill. I'm wondering if we can just pause and answer questions at the end, because I'm just conscious that time is ticking away. And if I'm going to be online, I'm not sure your time frame, Audrey, but I'll stay over another 10 minutes after 12 if we got more questions. So we might flip it now. You interview me around this leadership initiative that was happened in about 8 months after the bushfires in the next year. It happened in 2021, this work we did. So I might give a snapshot, Audrey, to save you ask me a question, of what this work that I did with 50 principals in schools in rural and remote areas of New South Wales. So these schools were smallish schools. They had the heavy load of not only bushfires, but floods happening pretty close together. And these school principals were really carrying the community, not only their school, but they were carrying the grief in the community of loss of houses, loss of life, and they were burnt out, incredibly burnt out. So the Department of Education got me in and two other coaches who I brought in as well, that we did the Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey with them. And that was like a gift to them, going, we understand you're really struggling and put every effort into supporting your community. And they wanted some independent people that they could talk to openly and honestly about what was happening for them and their well-being at the time. And so we did the Global Leadership Wellbeing Survey. They did a self-assessment, they did a debrief, and one follow-up coaching session. So over to you, Audrey. You can ask me questions.
I was just saying it. Just keep going. You're just doing grand. I mean, I don't want to interrupt your flow. Great introduction. Thank you. And then in addition to the individual focus, which was the primary focus, but relevant to the conversation we've just had, the other thing that the department was able to do was, without breaching confidentiality of looking at any individual's principal's report, but the aggregated data, the value of aggregated data for 50 odd principals, so that we could look at the thematic, so that Annette could look at the thematic levels and then feed that back to the department. Well, hopefully we'll get on to that bit. And one question I asked you, Annette, when we were chatting through it was about when you were When you introduce the GLWS tool and the framework to the principals, I guess it's a twofold question. What shifted for the principals after having had that conversation? And in what way was having the GLWS framework or survey or reports different from simply the gift of you turning up and being their confidant? Because you said they needed to talk.
Yeah.
They needed an ear.
Yes, they needed an ear, but an independent ear. So someone it was private, confidential, and there was no worry of, is my performance going to be measured? This is just, they could just be authentic as possible. So what they gained is, because a lot of their focus was on the work side of things, they'd let go of what did they need to fill their cup up outside of work, because many of them had to have rebuilding the buildings because they burnt down. And then there was also that trauma in the community. They'd really let go of self and not focused on self at all. And so what it did is gave them a concrete insight into, why am I feeling crap? Because I'm not putting emphasis on some of these key things other than knowing I'm not getting enough sleep or knowing I'm not getting enough exercise. But there were other things that they could put into place, and having someone, a family member or a friend that they could download with outside of work. So there were just having a concrete understanding of, what does fully thriving look like, because many of them had no sense of what, they just knew that they were exhausted and totally burnt out.
And sorry, I'm so bad at this, Annette, I'm going off track. When you turn up to people who have been through such an ordeal and are barely hanging in there, in my experience, they don't like to or can't even relate to the concept of thriving. Do you have to moderate expectations? Because if you think about the report, I imagine you wouldn't be able to take people from being red and amber to green just by, I know you're good, but you're not going to turn everyone green just as a result of an hour.
Yeah, and I'm going back to this part, and that's why I really liked mentioning it, because this was our way into the conversation. And we spent a lot of the time in the debrief talking about, tell me what's happening for you at the moment in terms of work. So this was the entry into building the trust. And tell me about, you highlighted you're struggling or you're languishing. Tell me what's happening at the moment for you. So that was our way into building trust and being that sounding board of, what am I currently experiencing at the moment? So then we could hear that story. And a lot for listeners there, they actually put some more detail here, many of them. So we could explore that with them before going into debriefing their results.
But what we typically find is that when people see a profile like that and there's a lot of red or amber, for some it might be confronting, but for most, they know this, and there is a relief in seeing it acknowledged, and it can be helpful to have the words around it. And then it's down to the skill of the practitioners like Annette, who are then able to convey fully that this is not a judgment. It's not bad on men because they're not green on all these things. This is a reflection of their lived reality. And then Annette has the conversation that says, not how do we turn you green on all these things, but of everything that's here, where might you be able to have some more control? And Annette, this kind of leads me into your question around, you had these conversations with individuals about what they could do, but you also recognized that there were some strong messages for the department about system overload and the stuff that we were talking about at the beginning about expectations and what was sustainable. So can you say a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And I'll just mention here before I answer that question, is it was also important to highlight what was working for them. And so this particular Taylor Hope, who's a fictitious person, there's something going on around her authentic relationships that is supporting her. So it's also finding out the good stuff of what is working that they continue to do. So the self-awareness piece is crucial. And then what would you need to put into place to move the scale in terms of balance or boundaries and that? So it's not just looking at what's not working. It's also some people just intuitively have been able to have some of these things in place. So it's really being concrete around what is working for me that I can continue to do.
And so true of many people who face it's a really significant adversity. And maybe some of you can think about that. But when your work turns to shit, excuse the vernacular, if it's turning to shit and you've got good people in the organization who have got your back, and you don't feel that they think you've turned to shit, it's the work that's turned to shit. That is a significant protective factor. So the authenticity of the trust and the feeling secure, not being able to let go of a lot of the fear of, oh God, it's all turned to custard. How bad must I look?
Yeah.
And then the other thing I suspect for those principals was the enormous sense of meaning and purpose. You talked a bit about how important they were to their communities, not just to the school, but to the whole community, and doing their bit. So there's a lot of, you're right, it's important to look at why are you still here? Why are you still showing up? What is sustaining you? And then the conversation about how long can that carry you on or sustain you forward before you become unwell, before the effects of burnout are felt.
Yeah.
So the department,
go.
The department piece of it.
Yeah. So what was the end result of it? It went over 4 months because there was the completing the survey, the debrief, and the follow-up coaching session. And the follow-up coaching session was about, given these results and you're looking into your own, what's going to make the biggest difference? Where should you focus? So we heard themes, myself and the other two coaches who were working, we heard themes and we pulled together the themes that we were hearing. And we did ask a question at the end of the conversation: what would you recommend the Department of Education does to better support your well-being? And some of the things that came out of it was, we need a more constructive style of leadership rather than picking on the things that aren't working, but just noticing the good stuff that's already there. Not just be sent the number to the employee assistant program if you're struggling. They wanted to speak to a human. The other was the administration aspects of their role was exhausting because they're trying to support the community and the people and the trauma that was in the community. They didn't have time for the administration things. So a lot of these recommendations that they were suggesting, as what we heard, there's been action taken on it at a system level. And one guy said, look, I'm trying to rebuild the school, as in physically rebuild it. And I'm also trying to support the community. Can you just have one person who's the point of contact for the builders when they've got questions to ask around it? Because that will just take a huge load off me, because I can't think of those concrete things about building as well as the trauma and supporting my staff as well as the community. So it's amazing, since it's 3.5 years on, and much of the recommendations have been progressed, which is awesome.
And it really speaks into the connection between the focus on the individual's well-being and how much of their own well-being is down to them versus the psychosocial context at work and also psychosocial context outside of work. And for those of you whose roles are more in the policy, or you've got responsibility for well-being in organizations, of course, you'll be more than fully aware of the rise of the psychosocial health risk management obligations. And so a lot of that data that you were gathering with that question, and also the average scores coming through in the profile, feedback into, here's some guidance for the organization about how it can manage its risks and hazards related to. and their obligations increasingly. Is what was being asked fair, legal, safe, etc.?
Yeah. So I'm conscious of time, and just to wrap up this case study, I think it was a really good example of they had been provided bushfire relief and support in the early stages, at the acute stage, but this was 8 months, a year after, and they hadn't anticipated that level of pressure that principals are under in terms of supporting the trauma in the community. So it's a lovely example of, what do you need? What do you need right now? How, as a system, can we support you now? And this was, yeah, they all were overwhelmingly positive around, that's what I needed, but I needed someone independent, that I knew it was confidential. I didn't need, here's a number to call employee assistance program. It was like, it was more deep, more in depth than that. And they found it like a really positive initiative that helped. And some of the ones who were in very trauma impacted areas where there was a lot of suicide in the community, they had more coaching. They were given more coaching sessions to support them. So it was just a lovely example of seeing what was going on in a system in terms of well-being, and what can we do to support that at that particular time. So I'd really love to open it up to questions. And if you can hang on a little bit longer, I didn't check with you, Audrey, if you're free to hang on about 10 minutes, 10 past 1.
Happy to.
Yep, that would be awesome. So opening up to the floor, Jill, you had a question that you put in the chat. We might start with that and then go to some of the, sorry, I've missed some of the things. So you said, Jill, in terms of women having a sense of purpose in their role, is there any evidence that women working in service type roles have greater sense of purpose than women working in corporate sales types roles?
I can't answer that question specifically, but I can answer a version of it, which is that we know that individuals, men and women, who work in organizations that are high for purpose organizations report higher levels of meaning and purpose and sense of fulfillment and use of strengths, but they're also reporting higher levels of burnout risk. So it's where the notion of passion and purpose can be toxic. And I've had a little dalliance earlier in life doing research around workaholism, and it's a similar connection, that where you're really vested in the ideals of the organization and its mission, then we don't want to give up on that. I think there's some homeward bound connection, people on the calls are homeward bound, supporting women in science to progress. And in one of my early conversations, I remember distinctly them saying, Audrey, we don't have time for our well-being, we are saving the planet. And it was quite hard to argue with that. But of course, the logic is, you might think staying up till past midnight every night is expediting the saving of the planet, but you will do far better work for far longer if you can fill your own cup and put some boundaries in place. But it's hard to have that conversation when people are very passionate about it. So I hope that vaguely answers your question there, Jill.
Other questions, comments, queries?
I'm curious, Audrey, about the data around the trends for women having shifted post-epidemic. And I guess what I'm seeing inside of organisations is some really interesting trends around less flexibility around the way we work, which I find in practice is causing enormous tension for men and women who've become used to work patterns that are far more flexible and conducive to how do I manage my whole life versus how do I manage my work life as my priority over my personal life. I'm curious in the work that you're doing, whether that's surfacing. And a concrete example is big businesses saying, I need you in the office full time now. Or I need you in the office 4 days a week and we can't manage a flexible start or finish time anymore.
It's a bit of a hornet's nest, isn't it? The hybrid flexible work practices. And I think it is really complicated. We have studied it. We've got a separate paper on hybrid work practices and its association with well-being versus its association with productivity versus engagement and job satisfaction. So what we know for certain is flexible work practices are very highly correlated with job satisfaction and retention. Job satisfaction is not completely related to job performance or productivity or engagement, actually. But by removing practices that have been set up since COVID, you're certainly running a very high risk of creating dissatisfaction and a motivation to leave. The research in relation to productivity and work practices, I think, shows that some jobs working from home is highly correlated with higher levels of productivity, and for other jobs, less. And so I think the difficulty is about having a blanket rule for all jobs, and that then, where that blanket rule doesn't make sense to people in leadership or complex roles, that is just antagonistic. I think it feels disrespectful that we can't make those judgments for ourselves. The link between hybrid work practices and well-being is another thing, and it's a little bit disappointing personally, because I would like to come out and say, yes, we should all have flexible work practices, but actually for some people with pre-existing anxiety levels or pre-existing social discomfort or pre-existing inability to manage our own time because we become workaholics and don't switch off, then there is quite a lot of information to support that working from home overdoes the autonomy and leaves people isolated and more insecure. So it's a really difficult thing for organizations to manage. It requires a level of subtlety, and it's really a conversation about what are the individual factors that need to be considered and what are the organization's factors and the team factors. But for some of us working from home, while we might like it on paper and it's efficient and effective, it actually can be a recipe to less sleep, more anxiety, more isolation, more worry, less, because we have so much autonomy. That's a bit of a downer to end on, isn't it? We have to have another one.
Any other questions, comments, queries, Audrey?
I have a question. And you touched on, I think Audrey touched on the risk elements, the risk management element of wellbeing. What I'm seeing more in organisations, or my experience, has been there seems to be an increasing, almost what I call outsourcing of the wellbeing and emotional support. So it's seeing this rise of EAP programs, but other forms of support, which I in some way feel is disconnecting the leaders or the people around from actually leaning in and provide the support. Because I think someone also said that's where the protection element comes in. Well, I know we're talking about coaching as one strategy and mechanism for doing it. Is there anything else you've seen? Is that a trend that others are seeing or you're seeing more of? And how can we address it in organisations, I guess, is my question.
Do you want me to take that, Annette? Or
Yeah.
Yeah.
You go.
And so I think that people leaders have got the memo about they are more responsible now than they've ever been and are feeling the pressure to make sure that their staff well-being is okay. As an aside, my response is your staff's well-being, you cannot give to people what you don't have yourself. So leaders must be well to lead. As a slightly more granular response to that, I think leaders are fearful of saying the wrong thing, doing the wrong thing. They've got the memo, and so they're feeling inadequate as pseudo-psychologists, and the message is not being heard appropriately, which is, oh no, we're not expecting line managers to be psychologists or coaches or counselors. We're expecting you to have conversations about how are you and to what extent are you struggling, striving, languishing, thriving. And where somebody's saying, look, I'm doing it tough, is to understand why that is and where the reasons for that are to do with individual factors and or factors outside of work. Then the line manager's job is as a conduit and to activate a referral. But we have this concept about how to explain well-being or deconvolute, unpack well-being. The message that I'd like managers and organizations to understand is that well-being is also a function of, yes, individual factors, yes, homework factors, but it is about the role that they're doing, the design of those roles, the climate that they're working in, the interpersonal relationships, the psychological safety, as opposed to psychosocial health overall, and organizational policies. And those are things that leaders should lean into much more and can't delegate. And so I think, to answer your question, Jenny, I think we're seeing a lot of people hitting the panic button, sending people to EAP. EAP are not equipped, generally speaking, to have organizations that coaches would have relating to the organizational factors or that line managers would have.
Yes.
Yeah.
You said it beautifully. I think that's what I'm getting to. The elements that leaders should be leaning into.
Yeah.
They're not, because they're not feeling a whole lot of reasons.
And that for those conversations to take place, we've been doing an awful lot of work over the last 2 years about the link between high levels of well-being and a high level of skills. Because to improve other people's well-being and our own well-being, you've got to be able to have the skills for advocacy, listening, curiosity, problem solving, empathy, great questioning style. And they're things that we should be teaching, and whether that's in leadership development. So most of our work using the GLWS sits in OD and D, coaching, team interventions, and where it's used in a well-being program, it really ideally would be used as a screen to say, you're ideal to go and see EAP, because it's about individual and home factors, and line managers and anybody else in the organization, we're not really able to deal with that.
Thank you.
I had a really good example of someone I coached a couple of weeks ago who said to me, her line manager, and she's in a really senior role and being convinced to go the next level. And her line manager is so supportive of her in progressing. But she said to me, you know what? I cannot be my authentic self in this organization. She said, and I don't know if I want that next step. So those skills are so important around what's the system demonstrating in term, and that was impacting her well-being, because she said, I can't be genuine and real here because of how I'm experiencing other senior people within the business. So it was a great example of, it's not going to do nothing in helping her with her well-being. It's the system that is not, she can't be who she really is. So I'm conscious of time. I want to do a big thank you to Audrey for being available for this conversation. What's going to happen from here is I'll be sending you all an email with the link so you can actually gain access to the report. I'll also be sending you what you can do about it in terms of further developing your own personal understanding of well-being. And I have a few options available in terms of just a quick version of doing the profile and getting a debrief, to more comprehensive being involved in group coaching. And I have a program starting in December for 10 leaders being involved in that at a time. So I'll put that all in the email, so I don't want to waste any more of your time. But thank you for the questions. Thank you for coming along today, and you'll get access to the recording as well if that's something that you would like to go back over some of it, but particularly for the people who signed up and weren't able to make it today. But big thank you, Audrey.
Thank you. It was an absolute pleasure. And if anybody has got any brilliant ideas about what else we should be doing with this data and where to get it out to, and please tell me, because I'm just the nerdy nerd that's creating the analysis. And I'm going, okay, we need to hand it over to real people in the real world. So do let me know. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Bye.